Hi, and welcome to Sustainably Interested, also known as SUSTA-IN. This is where we'll be exploring the potentials of transforming hobbies and interests into more sustainable forms. I'm Anna, the creator of SUSTA-IN, and to kick this thing off, we'll be deep diving into 3 of my interests and see how we can make them more sustainable. So, the interest that we'll be attempting today is machine sewing, specifically for patchwork. As you can see, I have this gorgeous vintage sewing machine that was my grandma's at home, and that is enough reason for me to want to have a go at it. But it had a few problems for quite some time and it was only recently repaired. So here we are. I've had my eye on patchwork for quite some time thanks to YouTube recommending me quilting videos, but quilting doesn't really fit into my context, so we'll be making patchwork pillowcases instead. I'll be following this tutorial by Minky Kim and making a few adjustments to fit my pillow stuffing. It looks like easy enough to attempt for a beginner like me. And before we get into this exciting project, we first need to figure out how to make it more sustainable. To start, you can ask yourself basic questions and answer according to what you would like to try or attempt. Here's mine. Just like that, you can now head on into the project with a plan to substitute fabric, book press one cover and iron the other cover, and collect waste for evaluation. The first thing we need to do for this project is to substitute fabric. Old bed sheets, old clothes, scrap fabrics instead of new ones from your home or from the thrift store. The only thing to be cautious about is your own experiences in handling different types of fabric. And for that reason, I chose 2 of my dad's old shirts that are cotton. The downside to using clothes, however, is the extra step of breaking it down so that you can get the most out of it, as you can see here. And also ironing them so that I can get nicer cuts. Then snip into squares. And we're done. For each front, I need 11 white squares and 11 grey squares. I didn't have enough big pieces for the second front, so I had to cut smaller squares instead. And I cut out these 2 big pieces for the back of the pillow. Remember the other goal I had about collecting wasted materials? I'll be keeping the fabric in this box here. Now let's start sewing. Right off the bat, I realized that the squares I've carefully cut were not all the same size, or actually square. But there's no turning back now, is there? After sewing the squares, I cut them into 1/8 to form half square triangles, and that's when you have to iron them so that they stay flat and all the fabric allowance stays on one side. To try and substitute using the iron, I pressed the pieces in random pages in this dictionary and piled a bunch of books on top to leave overnight. The results were pretty good. Not as flat, but at least they stayed open. Moving on to trimming the extra fabric on the corners. And it's back to sewing, this time the columns. Before heading over to the iron, I did some finger pressing because the seam allowance needs to face alternate directions. As for the non-iron ones, I rubbed slightly more to create a bit of heat from the friction so that it stays in place long enough to be placed under the stack of books. As expected, the half square triangles came out in different shapes and sizes, which ended up in some rows being taller or shorter. Seems like for patchwork, if you manage to cut your squares right, you'll have an easier time sewing. Finally, sewing the rows together. This part has to be the hardest part of this entire project. You might have thought that sewing in a straight line would have been the easiest thing, but man, it was a struggle. And here's after sewing all the rows together, ironed and pressed. Can you tell which one is the iron one and which one is the book pressed one? Pretty hard to guess, right? But if you look closely enough, the size difference actually gives it away. I then chose to iron the book pressed one to make up for the size difference and then sewed the lining and back pieces together. For the lining, I used some scrap fabric I had lying around and voila! And that's it. I'm pretty satisfied with how it turned out, and it matches my couch really well. I'm also really proud of the button-up bags on the pillows because it's not something that you would necessarily put on a pillowcase unless you were using old shirts. But one thing's for sure, I have to improve on my cutting. The imperfect squares really made everything like 10 times harder. Lastly, let's look at the waste that I've gathered. I think the thing that I wasted the most was thread. I seem ripped a few times because the sewed line was too crooked to be passed on, but I think the only way to reduce this amount is probably through experience, because you always mess up the first few times when trying out a new handicraft. I hope you all enjoyed the video, and if you want to learn more about Sustainably Interested, you can head on over to the website in the description below. Okay, bye!